today we are going to be discussing, as I mentioned before, some of the past housing efforts, things that have been done in Livingston and Park County, a review of the 2018 Housing Coalition meetings. That's kind of a list of the reports that I've gone through and pulled some highlights from. And then we want to kind of discuss why we're here. What are we doing this for? How has the, how has the housing situation changed over the last 2 years since the Housing Coalition last met? I'll also go over the Park County Housing Work Plan. This coalition and this reconvening of the coalition is just one part of a larger effort that will include an assessment, a working group, an action plan. And so ultimately, what we hope to leave this with is a housing action plan specific to Park County that will have actionable strategies, financing mechanisms, and very clearly defined responsibilities for each of the participants that will help to address the housing shortages across the housing spectrum in Park County. I want to leave a lot of space for discussion. I would love to hear any feedback about what happened. I know that we have a lot of folks who were involved with the reports that I reviewed. So if there are any highlights that I miss, I certainly encourage you to chime in and during the discussion portion to let me know or let us all know of kind of some highlights that should be pointed out. But I also wanted to discuss the, how the community has changed over the last 2 years. So, but anyways, we'll have by the end of this process, we'll have an action plan. And yeah, so that's kind of a quick overview. Like I said, we'll have a robust discussion, lots of space for feedback from everybody, what community support is going to be needed in the coming months. I'll talk about how we intend to do the assessment and how we intend to do the action plan. And then I'll go over the upcoming meetings. And then we're also going to leave some space because, there are, and I think it's important to talk about some of the current housing projects. I know that, a lot of people felt like the 2018 Housing Coalition kind of went on the back burner, but there was actually quite a few, after reviewing the 2018 meeting notes, a lot of the action items that came out of those meetings have really made some progress. So we'll get some updates on the Blue Bunch Flats project, which is the LIHTC project there in Livingston, the Vista View project, which is a resident-owned community project, and then the HRDC Livingston cabins as well. So we'll provide you with some project updates because along with being participants in this coalition, we want you to be champions of affordable housing in Park County. And there are a lot of good things happening. And we want people to know that, this isn't an idle topic. There are a lot of things that are happening in the county that are making progress towards addressing the housing shortages.
And Ryan, I just want to add that we do have representatives from 2 of those projects here to speak with us. Julie, who's going to be talking about Blue Bunch Flats, and then James, who will be talking about the NeighborWorks project. So thank you to Julie and James.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you both for being here. So to start with, I'll start with Gavin and I'll start with the Gavin and Barb's effort. We Will Park County, some of the highlights that that kind of came from the We Will Park County study. Again, that was a series of 5 reports, and housing affordability and availability was only one of those 5. But some of the things that were pulled out from there were, I think a stark number was, and it was one of the highlights of that report was that at the time, the percentage of households that were spending over 30% on housing had reached 31%. And they were also noting that the single family median price, and this was in 2019, had reached, for a single family home, had reached $300,000 in the community of Livingston. And then the condo median price had reached approximately $220,000. So, and I was looking at numbers today from 2018, and those numbers had increased by double digits from just 2018 to 2019. So I think that you know, the Weevil Park County study really highlighted how working families and moderate income families are being priced out of the Livingston community and the broader Park County community. The next report that we reviewed was the Successful Gardener report, and I know that Pat Balsey was on that committee who put that report together with Future West. And this report was a really in-depth report talking about some of the housing price trends down in Gardner. The 2018 median sale price had reached $320,000. There was a noted decrease in the number of rentals and a noted increase in the lease rate on each of those, on the remaining rentals. From 2012 to 2018, Successful Gardener noted that there had been a 92% increase in rent rates from 2012 to 2018, averaging, so an average unit, one bedroom, went from $600 in 2012 to $1,100 in 2018. That was a pretty eye-opening finding that came from the Successful Gardener report. Some of the other things that they noted were some significant affordability gaps. Median rents of $1,100. If you're going by housing burdened rates, median rents would require an income of $45,000 a year to afford, and 47% of the residents in Gardner had incomes less than $50,000. So I think that points to a pretty significant issue in terms of the affordability gap. In terms of the affordability gap for purchase prices, the median purchase price of $320,000 would have required an income of $60,000, and 50% of Gardner residents' incomes fall below that income threshold. So there's a real affordability gap for ownership as well, not just rentals. You can't talk about housing in Gardner without talking about short-term rentals, and that'll certainly be a topic of discussion for us as we move forward. The Successful Gardener report done in 2019 reported that there were 96 short-term rentals in 2015 and 120 in January of 2019. So that was a pretty stark increase, and that was just Gardner proper. 260 in the wider Gardner area. So as you can see, that the short-term rentals have expanded pretty quickly, pretty rapidly in the community of Gardner. The other issue in Gardner, and actually across the entirety of Park County, is the total acreage of buildable land in Gardner is only approximately 25 acres. So there's not a whole lot of space on which to build actual affordable housing. So some of the strategies that came out from that Successful Gardener report was increase and preserve the supply of affordable housing. I feel like that one was obviously going to bubble to the surface. An issue that's actually kind of present in most of the reports is building organizational capacity and financial capabilities. So a lot of folks feel like there are issues and there are a lot of people who are sitting around the table talking about housing and housing affordability, but there isn't a whole lot of organizational capacity to drive a process that might solve the problem. And then obviously another big issue all across Park County would be regulatory issues. So the successful Gardner report does bring up at least considering regulatory approaches to addressing affordable housing. So it was a really comprehensive report, and kudos to Future West for putting that together. The next one would be the HRDC Community Needs Assessment, which we did in 2017. Some of the findings from that in Gardner, again, some of the same threads. 38% of people were reporting that home purchasing had become difficult due to income, a lack of income, or rising prices. 30% said that there was a lack of available homes with actually available to purchase. And then an issue that again comes up pretty frequently when we talk about housing affordability, 11% cited down payment or closing costs as a significant barrier to home ownership in the community. From a business perspective, and this is something that we'll talk about frequently as well, business owners believe there has been a decrease in housing options affecting their ability to recruit and retain quality employees. And I think that we're seeing that all across Park County. An interesting finding in the HRDC assessment was that construction has actually kept pace with the population growth. However, it could not keep pace with the conversion of units to short-term and seasonal use. So that was something that popped up as a major concern in the housing needs assessment that was done by HRDC. Higher demand for rental housing that is often not based on the economic conditions present in the community was something that popped to the surface in the needs assessment, which essentially means that
Ryan, you seem to have stalled out briefly there.
All right. Can you hear me?
It sounded fine to me, Brian. You're good to go. I don't know if anyone else had the problem.
Okay. Well, holler or type, let me know if you can hear. I apologize for technical difficulties. Let's see here. All right. Well, just holler if you can't hear me. So, anyways, I thought one of the interesting takeaways from the HRDC Community Needs Assessment was that the higher demand for rental housing was often not based on the economic conditions that were present in the community, which essentially meant that incomes that were not being earned in Park County were being used to pay the leases and the rental rates in places like Gardner and Livingston, which makes it difficult for your local workforce to compete when you have people with wages from outside communities willing to pay higher prices and kind of pushing out and pricing out some of your local workforce. Moving on. So I like to point to the Blue Bunch Flats as a example of one of the, I think it's kind of a byproduct of the 2018 meetings. The 2018 meetings talked about the need for subsidized multifamily high density housing, and the Blue Bunch Flats is a LIHTC project, LIHTC standing for Low Income Housing Tax Credit. It's a great program all across the country. They did a market study for the Blue Bunch Flats project, and it was pretty interesting. Some of the highlights of that, highlights or lowlights, depending how you view it. They thought the there was a shortage in the number of new units this is Livingston proper. There was 91 new units were needed to keep up with the pace of growth in the city of Livingston. They also noted, and this was 2017, but I don't think it's probably changed, the market rate vacancy in 2017 was 0.0%. So there was basically no vacancy for market rate apartments, and that held true for both low income apartments and senior apartments. So all three of those categories, low income, market rate, and senior apartments, it was discovered that the vacancy rate was 0.0%. So, and that's pretty shocking. Each one of the rental units that they spoke with had a waiting list, and all of the existing income restricted units were 100% occupied with a waiting list between 14 and 36 individuals and families. So that really illustrates an immense amount of pressure on your local rental market when you have 0% vacancy and 14 to 36 individuals and families on the wait list for each of those properties. I mean, that's just makes for a very, very difficult living situation for all of the people involved. They also noted from a 0.85% annual increase in the population year over year. And then for Park County broader, a population increase of 0.5% per year. And then there was a projected growth that they were expecting from 2017 to 2022. They expected growth to increase to 0.8% annually in Park City. Obviously, with all of these findings, this was a market study based on pre-COVID conditions. So that will be a topic of discussion as we move forward. Is, are these conditions still relevant in a post or in a COVID world? Because I think that we might see some changing conditions. HRDC has the Livingston Cabins, which is 12 units that will be placed up at the corner of Reservoir. And some of the findings from that we did a mini market study, and there was a projected increase in the number of renter households of 143 over the next 5 years, and that's just in the community of Livingston. And then a projected total number of household increased by 437 over the next 5 years. So those were some of the stats that we pulled from the market study that we did for the Livingston Cabins. So as you can see, there's been a pretty significant amount of study, and there's been a pretty significant amount of work that's been put into kind of understanding what the conditions were, both in Gardner and in Livingston and really all across Park County. But really, the bulk of the work was done by the 2018 Housing Coalition, and I went through the meeting notes for these meetings, and it was actually, while they were talking about some fairly difficult topics and talking about some fairly difficult conditions to address, I was encouraged by what they talked about, what they decided were their top priorities, and how they plan to address it, and what they wanted to do kind of post that series of meetings. So if you can recall, I know several of you were participants in those meetings, but in February of 2018, they held their first meeting, and the topics that they discussed were the housing inventory. So they were discussing a shortage of available housing units and income not matching the market. They talked about resource allocation for municipalities, understanding that there are a pretty limited amount of resources that municipalities have available to them to address affordable housing. And so, one of the topics that they spent a long time discussing was, how do we know the best way to utilize those limited resources? And there was a pretty robust discussion around that. The other discussion that they had, which is in line with all of the reports that I read as well, debt and lack of resources. So people lacking the income to put down payments on places or to put security deposits on places, and income. Even in 2018, they were noticing that income really didn't match the market. And then the discussion kind of wrapped up in at least the February meeting, talking about the possibility of rezoning, infill development, and increased density, which is always a fertile topic to talk about in Park County. Moving on to their second meeting, which was in May, they discussed a Junto housing proposal, which would have required some zoning adjustments. So the zoning conversation continued. They talked a lot, again, in line with the reports, about rental vacancy for both below market rate units and market rate units, basically being 0.0%. So it was an issue there as well. And then a topic that will always come up when discussing affordable or housing in Park County was non-owner occupied housing and the proliferation of Airbnb and VRBO. The meetings kind of started to focus on action items, and then so this was not February. This was July. They did an informal survey of coalition participants, and they were asked to rank the housing issues that they were discussing. And at the time, the top three in order of importance, number one was market rate subsidized rentals. Number two was market rate rentals. And number three was market rate home ownership. So later when we have a discussion about kind of some of the takeaways that you guys noticed in these meetings, I would love to hear if you feel like those are still the top priorities. They also discussed land availability, again, similar to the successful Gardner report. A lack of land is definitely one of the bigger barriers. They noted the lack of land specifically for high density multifamily housing, which was an interesting topic, which I think led to, or at least went in line with, the development of the Blue Bunch Flats. And then they had some business leaders involved in the discussions, and they were talking about the difficulty with recruitment and retention of their talented workforce because of the lack of available housing options for new employees or growing families. Then meeting number 4, this was held in September. They discussed, again, vacation rentals. At that point, the number in Livingston had grown to 250 in 2018, with 80 outside. That's not counting Gardner. But as you can tell, the number of VRBOs and Airbnbs has increased. They also discussed the the discussion was there was a lot of discussion around who is responsible for affordable housing. I think that they came to kind of a consensus that this was not the sole problem of a municipality. They thought that the solutions needed to be community-based, and I think HRDC agrees with them that there are roles for everyone to play. And then they also discussed the housing spectrum and some of the gaps within that. So some of the gaps in emergency housing, an emerging problem with homelessness, a lack of workforce housing, the issue of seasonal housing, and then the availability of senior housing also came up. And finally, I think you can't have a discussion about housing without discussing wages. And this is a topic that they brought up as well. And there was some robust discussion about jobs being created in Park County and the wages that are being paid with those jobs. So some of the takeaways. So again, I mentioned earlier that reading through these meeting notes was actually pretty encouraging. Some of the takeaways were to continue the current work. So continue on Blue Bunch Flats, continue on the Livingston cabins, continue with the emergency, the warming center in Livingston. So that part was pretty encouraging to see that, you know, some of the takeaways from the 2018 coalition meetings have really continued to this day, and I really feel like this is a good continuation of that effort. They also wanted to incorporate more community feedback to guide the housing priorities. They didn't want to be seen as making decisions about housing in a vacuum. So they really wanted to find methods and instruments to incorporate community feedback. So I think that that's something that we'll incorporate into our work plan as well. And then, again, I was super encouraged to see that they wanted to utilize the coalition to develop a needs assessment report and a action plan with very specific responsibilities, which is something that we hope to walk away from these meetings with. So that's kind of an overview of how we got to today. It's a lot of effort on a lot of people's parts, and again, I think it's important to let everybody know how much we appreciate the efforts that have been put in up to this point. So, so where we're at now, I guess I can pause for any questions, or if anybody has any feedback they'd like to add now, this would be a good opportunity to do that.
Or also if there's any additions from folks who have thoughts on other studies that have happened. I know Brian kind of did a high level overview of some of the work that's been done, but if there's any other work that you guys know about that you want to highlight as part of the housing effort here in Park County, we'd love to hear other stories and other highlights as well.
Well, the school board in Gardner is in the process of working out a ground lease with our North Yellowstone Education Foundation. And the purpose, because we have a piece of property that the school owns that was actually purchased in the 80s with the intent for teacher housing. And so that has been moving forward and will probably be, that will be presented to the Board of Ed at our June meeting, and then the ball then will go over to NYEF, and their goal is to continue their capital fundraising efforts to be able to build housing that would first be for teachers, but then also might be affordable housing for if the school did not need it. So we're still in the process of working out what that looks like, but the potential to build some housing may at least be forthcoming in Gardner a little bit. As far as successful Gardner, we now have a steering committee since Future West has our consulting with them has finished, and we're in the process of trying to figure out what our next step is. We're headed towards possible plan for looking at a zoning work with the Park County. And so that's just in the beginning stages. So that's about where we are in Gardner with that.
Thank you, Pat.
Thanks, Pat.
I know Laura Williams is on as well, and I'd love to, Laura, if you have a second to talk about the housing co-op and the great work that you've been doing there. Love an update or just an overview.
Sure, we're still in the initial plans, but basically we've worked with the state to do the initial registration for the Gardner Investment Cooperative. And this would be a group that would form of investors that are interested in building housing locally. We had planned on doing an initial meeting this spring, but we're hoping that the economy and the financial markets will recover enough that we'll get enough interest, and hope to do a public meeting in the fall. In the meantime, we're planning on doing a website and social media campaign to start educating people about what cooperatives can do in our communities, and specifically for housing in Gardner.
That's great.
Thank you, Laura. Were you able to let Barb back in? Barb got, just so you guys know, Barb got
Yep.
she lost internet at her house. And then Laura somehow was made the host, and Laura has to let now Barb into her meeting.
I think Barb
I'm not
is
sure
back.
if that's happened yet.
Yes,
Yeah,
Okay,
Barb is.
Barb, are you there?
I am back. That felt like having a fire drill in the middle of a meeting, but I'm glad that I was the only one impacted.
All right.
All good. Thank you.
So I guess the next thing I wanted to talk about is kind of like, why are we here? What are some of the expected outcomes? And I want to kind of touch on some of the key details of the Park County housing kind of work plan. As I mentioned earlier, the coalition is a huge part of the work that we're expecting to complete. We expect to have 4 meetings. In addition to this one, we'll kind of go over those details later. The other part will be an assessment that we're going to conduct. Actually, you know what? Why don't I go over so the coalition, I can go over the discussions. The coalition discussions moving forward after this kind of recap meeting to bring everybody up to speed. The first meeting will discuss home ownership. The second meeting will be a discussion of market rate and subsidized rental units. The third meeting will be a discussion of workforce and seasonal housing. The fourth meeting will discuss emergency housing and homelessness. And then we will have a wrap-up meeting and discuss what are the next steps within this process. So there'll be 4 very topical meetings and discussing very specific items, and then we'll wrap that up and move into the next phase of the work. And I'll share all of this work plan with everyone as we move forward. The next piece of the work plan would be to conduct an assessment. That's going to be a series of stakeholder interviews. That's where I'll look to the coalition to provide me with the names of people who we feel it's critical to talk to so that we can get a firm understanding of the current housing conditions. I'll do an employee survey to get a feel for the impact that housing issues are having on our local workforce. And then Barb and I discussed that, there's some people who might not have the access necessary to participate in a survey or a online Zoom meetings. So if this is needed, we discussed maybe having a community forum up in Shields Valley or doing some sort of town hall in some of the more remote areas of Park County to ensure that we're getting a good cross-section of people throughout the county and really getting a firm understanding of what are the conditions that that their communities are facing. So moving on from the Housing Coalition, from the assessment, the next step would be forming a working group, and I can, so the working group will focus on 3 essential work sessions. All of these sessions will be 2 or 3 hours. Prior to each session, there will be a lot of data disseminated and information about the topics that we'll be discussing. Session 1 will be tool identification and prioritization. So we'll look at what other communities across Montana and across the country have done, what tools are available to these communities, and how they might work within the Park County kind of context. Then we'll go through an exercise where we prioritize those tools and really come up with a list of strategies that are local, that are localized and community informed, that we really feel like we can pursue to address housing issues across Park County. Session 2, we would take that prioritized list of strategies. We would refine those tools. I would do some research, again, offline, and this would require some time before and after the meetings to dive into what does this really mean at a local level. So this strategy that worked in a community, somewhere else, how would that look in Park County? What would that really entail? And then we'll continue to refine those tools. And then step 3, we'll really get into the meat of, okay, these are the ways that we want to address housing in Park County. How are we going to finance these? What financing might be available? How will we pay for these efforts? We'll do a timeline. We'll discuss, what strategies need to be implemented right away, what strategies are good for a year from now, and what strategies are good for 5 years from now, and how are we going to fund those efforts. And then the most important part will be divvying up responsibilities. So going through a matrix of strategies, going and really assigning people with responsibilities towards implementing the tools that we've identified. So it's a very hands-on process that will give us a working document that lets us know how we're going to implement all of these tools and the timeline for doing it and the funding structures for getting them done. So it'll be an intense work session. So that's kind of the highlights of what we plan to do. So all of those things will essentially culminate in a work plan or a housing action plan that's specific to Park County, that can be utilized by all of the communities, and it'll be a set of tools that is available for each community facing housing shortages. So that's kind of what the overview of our action plan is for the upcoming months and year. And I really kind of want to get everyone's feedback on that. And this is kind of the portion of the meeting that I was hoping I could get some feedback on what opportunities might have been missed in 2018, what data were we missing in 2018 that we need to be sure and get in 2020, any potential, like high potential ideas that kind of surfaced during those meetings that deserve to be reconsidered, the capacity to address housing issues. Where do we lack capacity? Where do we need to build capacity? And obviously a huge factor in all of this will be, what has COVID done to the housing conditions? Are we still operating in the same environment? So that's kind of what I wanted to toss out to this larger group, to really get an idea of what you think of the plan and what do you feel like we could do differently or better.